The year was 1997. I was 26 years old, tired of city noise and the non-stop hum of everyday life. So, I packed up my gear and rented a small cabin deep in the North Carolina mountains, near the Blue Ridge Parkway. The cabin sat isolated in a dense forest of tall pines and oaks, far enough from the nearest road that you could barely hear cars, if any passed by at all. The idea was to get away for 2 weeks, have time to think, write, and clear my head. I arrived late afternoon, pulling my old Chevy pickup up a narrow dirt path that twisted through the trees. The sun was low, casting long shadows between the trunks and lighting up patches of golden leaves on the ground. The air was crisp, fresh, smelling of pine resin and earth. I remember thinking how quiet it was, the kind of quiet that wraps around you like a blanket, deep and thick. The cabin was small, made of rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney and a rusty metal roof. A front porch ran the length of the building with a few creaky wooden chairs. The door squeaked as I opened it, revealing a simple interior. A wood stove, a sagging couch, a narrow table with a battered lamp, and a small kitchen area with a sink and an old fridge. A single bed lay tucked in a corner. It smelled like damp wood and something faintly sweet, like the pine outside mixed with dust. I unloaded my things and lit a fire in the stove, the crackle and warmth settling in immediately. I had brought some canned food, a few books, a notebook, and a camera. No phone signal, no internet, no distractions. Just me and the woods. I planned to write every day, walk the trails, and maybe catch some trout from the nearby creek. The first few days were peaceful. I woke early, brewed coffee on the stove, and sat on the porch watching the mist drift through the trees. The forest was alive with birdsong and the rustle of squirrels. I spent hours walking along faint trails, breathing in the cool air, letting my thoughts wander. At night, I sat by the fire, writing in my notebook, the only sound the occasional pop from burning logs and the whisper of wind through the branches. But on the fourth day, something shifted. It was late afternoon again when I decided to explore a new trail I hadn't noticed before. The path was narrower, less traveled, tangled with low branches and thick undergrowth. I had to duck and step carefully to avoid thorny bushes. The air felt heavier here, damper. I noticed broken twigs on the ground and small patches where the leaves were flattened, as if someone had been there recently. I pushed forward until I reached a small clearing beside a rocky stream. The water was clear, running fast over smooth stones. I knelt to drink some, feeling the cold water slip down my throat. When I stood up, something caught my eye near the edge of the clearing. Something dark, wedged between two rocks. It was a boot, a single, worn-out hiking boot, mud-caked and torn. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It looked old, maybe a few years. It didn't belong to me, that was certain. I felt a chill creep up my spine. I looked around the clearing carefully. There were no signs of a camp, no other belongings, no footprints except my own. I dropped the boot back near the rocks and decided it was best to head back. The sky was already turning gray with heavy clouds, and the wind had picked up. I moved quickly, retracing my steps through the thick forest. As I walked, I kept thinking about the boot. Who had lost it here? Was someone else out in the woods? I didn't want to believe that anyone was nearby, not after I'd felt so alone the past few days. Back at the cabin, I checked the windows and locked the door before starting a fire. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the porch boards. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker. That night, I hardly slept. Every small noise, the creak of a branch, the rustle of leaves, made me jump. Around midnight, I heard something else, a faint snapping sound, like a twig breaking close to the cabin. I froze, heart pounding, ears straining in the dark. The sound stopped after a moment, and I told myself it was probably just a deer or a raccoon. The next day was colder and gray. I stayed mostly inside, reading and writing, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. I told myself I was imagining things. On the sixth day, things got worse. I woke before dawn, the room cold and quiet except for a faint tapping sound at the window. I stared through the glass, but saw only darkness and the outline of trees swaying. I pulled the curtain closed tightly, Later, I went outside to fetch some firewood. As I walked around the cabin, I noticed fresh footprints in the dirt near the back porch. They were boot prints about the same size as mine, but I was sure they hadn't been there yesterday. The prints led into the woods, disappearing between the trees. My pulse quickened. I had made sure to lock the cabin. Who could have left them? The nearest house was miles away. I checked all the doors and windows again, making sure everything was secure. Then I loaded my old hunting rifle I had brought for protection, just in case, and placed it near the stove where I could reach it quickly. The rest of the day I stayed inside, keeping the curtains shut, only venturing out when the sun was high. I told myself that maybe a hunter or hiker had wandered close but not seen the cabin. Maybe they were just lost. That night, the tapping at the window came again. Louder this time, more insistent. I didn't look outside. Instead, I sat by the fire, holding the rifle tight, listening to my own breathing. The tapping stopped after a while, but the sound of footsteps circling the cabin started soft, slow, deliberate. Someone was walking all around the cabin, watching me. I stayed frozen until the footsteps finally moved away into the woods. The next morning, I left the cabin for a long walk, hoping the fresh air would calm me. I followed the creek downstream, the water churning over rocks and fallen branches. After an hour, I found a small makeshift camp hidden among the trees. It was rough. Some old cans, a torn tarp, footprints everywhere. There were no people in sight. I looked around for clues. Among the scattered trash was a worn leather wallet. Inside was a faded ID, a name I didn't recognize, and a photo of a man probably in his early 30s. The wallet was dry but dusty. Suddenly, it hit me. Someone had been living rough nearby, maybe for weeks or months, hiding out in the forest. Maybe that was the person who had lost the boot. I returned to the cabin quickly, thinking about what to do. The nearest ranger station was about 20 miles away, and the road was rough. My cell phone still had no signal. I debated whether to call the police or wait it out, but I realized that the unknown person was probably watching me already, maybe even lurking close to the cabin right now. The next night was worse than the one before. The tapping came again, but this time it was joined by low, muffled noises. Shuffling, breathing, something dragging across the porch boards. My nerves were raw. I stayed awake all night, clutching the rifle, waiting for dawn. When morning finally came, I checked the perimeter. The back door lock was scratched and loose, and there were clear marks on the porch floor. Heavy boots dragging something large. I packed a bag quickly with food, water, some clothes, my camera, and the rifle. I left the cabin locked and slipped away before the sun was high. The hike back to the main road was exhausting. I moved quickly but cautiously, constantly looking over my shoulder. I made it to a small gas station where I finally found a working phone and called the police. They arrived the next day with a search team. They combed the forest for miles, looking for signs of the person living rough. They found the camp I had seen and a few more items: old clothes, some empty bottles, and a tattered backpack. But no one. The officers told me people sometimes disappear into the woods, living off the land or hiding for various reasons. The person could still be out there or may have left quietly before the search. I never went back to that cabin after. It stayed rented out for a while, but I heard the owners eventually tore it down after more reports of trespassing and strange noises. Even years later, I remember the isolation. The cold fear of knowing someone unknown was so close, and the silence broken only by footsteps that shouldn't have been there. It taught me how fragile safety can be when you're truly alone, and how the woods hide more than just trees. I remember the first time I found that cabin. It was late September of 2018. I was 26 then, and I needed a break. The city was wearing me down. Constant noise, crowds, the endless rush. So I decided to rent a cabin somewhere quiet, away from everything. I searched online for weeks before settling on a small place in northern Vermont, near a town called St. Johnsbury. It wasn't fancy, just a rustic, old cabin set deep in the woods beside a lake. The pictures online looked peaceful, lots of trees, water nearby, and an old dirt road leading up to it. perfect for what I wanted: silence and space to think. I arrived late in the afternoon. The drive up had been long but beautiful. The trees were starting to change colors, bright reds and golds mixing with deep greens. The sky was overcast but calm. When I pulled up to the cabin, I saw it was smaller than I expected. It looked more like a big shed than a house. The wood was faded, cracked in places, and the roof sagged a little. Still, the porch was solid, and the lake was visible through the trees just 100 feet away or so. I got out of the car and stretched, breathing in the cold, sharp air. It smelled like pine and wet earth. The sun was dropping behind the hills, making the shadows stretch long and dark. I carried my bags inside. The cabin had a single room with a small kitchen corner, a wood stove, and a bed pushed against one wall. There was no internet, no TV, just a few old books on the shelf and some kitchen tools on the counter. That night, I made a fire in the stove and cooked some canned beans I had brought. The flames crackled, casting flickering light on the wooden walls. Outside, the forest was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. I felt good being alone, no distractions. I lay on the bed, the windows open a crack to let the cool air in, listening to the faint splash of water from the lake. The quiet was deep, almost heavy, but I liked it. The next day I woke early. The sun was weak behind thick clouds. I wrapped myself in a sweater and walked down the path to the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the gray sky like glass. I found a fallen log to sit on and stared out at the stillness. No boats, no people, just me and the water. The air was chilly, and the smell of wet leaves mixed with damp earth. A few birds called from the trees, but it was mostly quiet. I decided to explore the woods around the cabin. The forest was dense, mostly pine with patches of birch and maple. The ground was soft with moss and fallen needles. I walked for hours, following animal tracks and looking for signs of wildlife. Occasionally I heard twigs snap or leaves rustle, but never saw anything bigger than squirrels or birds. The woods felt peaceful but also vast, like they could hide anything. That evening, I made another fire and cooked a simple dinner of rice and canned vegetables. As darkness fell, the cabin felt colder. The stove helped, but I noticed the wind outside picking up. The trees creaked and moaned, and the lake lapped quietly against the shore. I read one of the books, an old nature guide, until the fire burned low and I went to bed. The next few days passed in a slow, quiet rhythm. I woke with the light, ate simple meals, walked the woods and sat by the lake. Sometimes clouds hid the sun, and rain came in light showers. Other times, the air was crisp and clear. I felt more relaxed than I had in years. No calls, no emails, just the raw, real world. But then something started to feel off. On the fourth day, while walking through the woods, I noticed the path near the cabin had changed. The dirt road that led from the main forest road to the cabin was clear and worn, but now there were new footprints in the mud. Not my own, and they weren't animal tracks. They looked fresh, deep, like someone had walked there recently. I stopped and studied them, but they stopped just a few feet from the cabin. There were no footprints going back the way they came, as if the person had vanished near the cabin. My heart beat faster, but I told myself it was probably a hunter or another hiker passing by. This area was popular in the fall for hunting season. Still, I didn't hear any voices or gunshots. The woods were silent. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard noises outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was the wind again, branches brushing the windows, leaves scraping the walls. But then I heard something else. Footsteps, heavy, slow, walking around the cabin's perimeter. I stayed frozen, trying to tell if I was imagining things. The steps stopped near the back door, then moved away again. I didn't sleep much that night. I stayed by the window watching the dark woods. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the only light was from the stove's embers. I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was a deer or a raccoon, but the footsteps were too deliberate, too heavy for an animal. The next morning, I checked the back door. The latch was still locked, but the doorframe had fresh scratch marks, deep and jagged. I didn't think any animal could make marks like that, not that size. I felt a chill run through me, but I tried to focus on practical things. Maybe some kid had been messing around or a hunter trying to find shelter. I told myself I'd call the rental owner and ask about it, but the cabin had no phone or internet, so I couldn't. I decided to stay inside more during the day, locking every door and window I could. The feeling of being watched stayed with me, even though I never saw anyone. I kept my phone charged, but I had no signal. On the 6th day, something worse happened. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard a loud bang on the front door. I jumped, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. The bang came again, louder this time, like someone trying to break in. I grabbed a heavy cast iron skillet from the stove and crept to the door, ready to defend myself. I peered out a small window beside the door. The porch was empty. No footprints, no signs of anyone there. The wind had picked up, and branches shook wildly. I opened the door slowly and looked around. Nothing. The woods were silent except for the rustling trees. I closed the door and locked it again, my hands shaking. Whoever had hit the door wasn't outside anymore, or maybe never had been. I sat down and tried to calm myself, but the fear stayed with me. The cabin didn't feel safe anymore. That night, I barely slept. Every noise made me jump. The wind howling, the creaking wood, the distant splash of the lake. I kept the stove burning all night for warmth and light. I didn't want to look outside. The next morning, I found something that made me more afraid than anything else. When I opened the front door, I saw a note pinned to the wooden frame with a rusty nail. The paper was old, torn, and wet from the rain, but I could read the words scrawled in rough handwriting. "Get out." I looked around, but there was no one. The woods were still. My hands trembled as I tore the note down and shoved it in my pocket. I knew I had to leave, but the car was stuck in mud from the rain, and the road was narrow and wet. I tried to start the engine, but it barely turned over. I spent hours pushing and rocking the car until it finally moved a few feet. I decided to walk to the main road and find help. I packed some food and water and locked the cabin door behind me. The woods seemed even darker now, the shadows thicker, as if hiding eyes watching me. I kept my eyes on the path, my heart racing. I walked for nearly 2 hours before I reached a small highway. I found a gas station and called for a tow truck. I told them to come get the car and promised to return for the cabin keys later. On the drive back to the city, I thought about everything that had happened. No one ever explained why someone was watching me or why they left that note. Maybe it was a warning from a local, or maybe a dangerous person lived nearby. Whatever the reason, I knew I was lucky to get away. After that trip, I never went back to that cabin. The pictures on the rental site were taken years ago, before the place started falling apart. I don't know if the owner ever told anyone about the strange visitor or the threats, but I kept the story to myself. Sometimes, late at night, I still remember the feeling of being alone in those woods, surrounded by silence that felt too heavy, as if something unseen was waiting just beyond the trees. But I'm okay now. I learned to trust my instincts, to listen when something feels wrong. The forest is beautiful, but it's also wild and unpredictable. Not every place is safe, even if it looks peaceful. Sometimes the scariest things don't have a clear answer. No ghosts or monsters, just real danger hiding in shadows. That trip taught me more than I expected. I still love the quiet of the woods, but now I respect their silence in a different way. I know when to leave, and I know that some places aren't meant for everyone. It was the fall of 1999 when I decided to take a break from the chaos of the city and retreat to a small cabin I had rented in the northern woods of Vermont. I was 27 then, working a dead-end office job that drained every bit of energy and will from me. The plan was simple: spend a week alone in the wilderness to clear my head and maybe write a little, though the truth was I wasn't sure what I was trying to find out there. The cabin was old but sturdy, a one-room wooden shack tucked deep into the forest, about 3 miles off the nearest dirt road. No cell signal, no internet, just me and the trees. The drive up was long, a slow, winding path through golden and red leaves that covered the ground like a thick, crunchy carpet. The air was sharp, cold, and smelled like wet pine and earth. I remember pulling up to the gravel clearing just before sunset, the sky painted in bruised purples and oranges. The cabin sat quietly beside a small frozen creek that gurgled faintly, its water thin but alive despite the cold creeping in. I spent the first hour unpacking. Inside, the cabin was dim but clean. A wood stove sat cold in the corner, and a simple cot with a thin mattress was pressed against one wall. A small kitchen counter with a sink and an old gas stove was opposite a window that looked out into the darkening woods. The walls were made of thick logs, stained by years of rain and wind, with gaps filled in by moss and hardened clay. The floor creaked with every step, and the only source of light inside was a hanging bulb that flickered whenever the wind gusted. I felt a strange mix of peace and unease. Peace because the city noise was gone, replaced by the sound of wind through branches and distant bird calls. Unease because the place felt isolated in a way that made me hyper-aware of every small sound. The wind rattling the window panes, the creek's faint burble, the scurrying of unseen animals in the underbrush. Each noise seemed amplified in the silence. That first night, I built a fire in the stove and sat by it, my hands warming against the iron plate. I hadn't brought much in the way of food, just some canned beans, bread, and a few energy bars. The cold seeped into the cabin's corners, and despite the fire, I wrapped myself in a thick blanket, watching shadows flicker on the walls. Sleep came hard. The unfamiliar sounds of the woods filled the night, and the silence between them was louder than anything. I remember waking up several times, feeling like something was out there just beyond the window watching. But when I looked, there was only darkness and the occasional movement of branches. Morning came slow and pale. The sun barely pierced the thick canopy of trees. I brewed coffee on the old stove, the smell grounding me. Outside, the woods stretched endlessly, a mix of evergreens and bare maples. The forest floor was littered with damp leaves and the occasional broken twig, like someone or something had passed through recently. I spent the next few days walking the trails, exploring the area around the cabin. The woods were alive with small animals, chipmunks, squirrels, the occasional deer, but always just out of reach. The deeper I went, the quieter it felt. No birds, no rustling. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. On the third day, I noticed something odd near the creek. Footprints. Large, heavy prints pressed into the muddy bank, heading upstream. They were too big to be human, wider and deeper, like someone wearing oversized boots. I followed the prints for a while, curiosity pushing me forward, until they stopped abruptly near a fallen tree. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I started locking the cabin door at night and keeping my small pocket knife close by. Still, nothing happened, just the constant feeling of eyes watching from the dark. The fourth night was the worst. Around midnight, a noise woke me up. At first, it was soft, a low scraping, like nails dragging over wood. Then came a series of heavy thumps against the side of the cabin. My heart hammered in my chest. I stayed frozen under my blanket, listening to the sound circle the cabin, stopping briefly outside the window, then moving to the back wall. I wanted to believe it was a large animal, maybe a bear or a wild boar, but the thumps were deliberate, not random. I didn't dare look outside. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching my knife, watching the dark window, waiting for the dawn. When morning finally came, the world outside was calm, almost serene. I went out to check for damage and found deep claw marks gouged into the cabin's wooden siding. Nearby, fresh broken branches littered the ground, and a large patch of disturbed earth indicated something big had been digging or pawing there. I debated leaving immediately but didn't want to admit defeat. Besides, the nearest town was miles away, and the roads were not in great shape for my old rental car. So, I stayed but made sure to keep a fire burning all night, using every scrap of wood I had to build a bright blaze. The next day, I packed a small bag with essentials and hiked back toward the main dirt road, hoping to find a ranger station or at least a passing vehicle. After about an hour, I stumbled on a small, abandoned hunting cabin. The door was hanging off its hinges, and inside, it smelled of mold and rot, but it offered a brief shelter from the biting wind. There was an old, rusted rifle leaning against a corner. I didn't know anything about guns, but the sight of it gave me a strange, uneasy comfort. I took it with me, unsure if it even worked, but at least it was something. That night, back at my cabin, I slept lightly, the rifle by my side. The noises returned, louder and more frequent. Scraping, thumping, sometimes a heavy breathing outside the walls. I was terrified but forced myself to stay calm. I remembered a survival article I'd read about animals and people being scared of fire and loud noises. I banged pots and shouted into the darkness, hoping to scare off whatever was out there. Nothing happened, only silence after the noise died. On the 5th day, the prince returned, closer this time, pressed into the soft soil just a few feet from the cabin steps. I could see the deep impressions of heavy boots, and between them, smaller, lighter tracks. Human tracks. I realized then that whatever had been circling the cabin wasn't an animal. It was a person. The thought sent a new kind of chill through me. I was alone in the woods, miles from help, and someone was watching me, waiting. That evening, I found the small generator I'd packed for emergencies had run out of fuel. The cabin was plunged into near darkness, except for the dying fire in the stove and the moonlight filtering through the window. I lit every candle I had and placed them near the door and windows, hoping the light would deter whoever was outside. But the noises didn't stop. At one point, I heard the door handle jiggle, slow and deliberate, but the door held firm. The wood was old but thick, and I'd wedged a heavy chair against it. Sleep was impossible. On the 6th day, I woke to silence. The forest was still and quiet. I packed everything I had and decided to leave before nightfall. The longer I stayed, the more danger I felt. As I stepped outside, I saw fresh footprints leading away from the cabin. They disappeared into the trees. I followed them cautiously, clutching the rifle. The trail led downhill toward a small dirt road. I hurried, heart pounding, until I saw a pair of headlights up ahead. I waved frantically until the car slowed and stopped. It was a couple heading back to town who agreed to give me a ride. Back in town, safe and warm, I reported the footprints and the strange noises to the local sheriff. They suspected an illegal poacher or a drifter living rough in the woods nearby. The area had seen an uptick in trespassers lately, and my cabin was probably an unwelcome intrusion. I never went back. It was the summer of 1997 when I first decided to escape the chaos of city life for a while. I was 27 then, worn out from a string of stressful jobs and restless nights. The city noise never stopped. The streets were always crowded, and the pressure to keep up with everything around me was unbearable. I needed a break, some quiet, something real. So I rented a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota, near a lake called Clearwater. The place was remote. No phone, no internet, barely any electricity. Perfect for what I wanted. The cabin was nothing fancy but solid. A one-room wooden structure with a small porch, a stone fireplace, and a tin roof that creaked when the wind blew. There was a small kitchen area with a wood stove and a sink that worked only when the water pump was turned on. The landlord told me there was a small generator, but it was finicky and best used only at night. I packed my old backpack, filled with clothes, food, a couple of books, and basic camping gear. I wasn't expecting to be out here long, maybe a week, just to clear my head. The drive there was long and winding. From Minneapolis, I took a narrow highway north, then turned off onto a gravel road that grew rougher and more narrow with every mile. The trees got taller and denser, blocking out the sun in patches. By the time I reached the cabin, the sky was already shading toward dusk. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. It was quiet in a way the city never was. No hum of traffic, no distant voices. Just birds calling and the rustle of leaves. I spent the first night settling in. I built a fire in the stone fireplace, cooked some canned beans and rice on the wood stove, and lay on the creaky cot looking out the small window at the dark forest. I could hear an owl hoot somewhere, and the occasional snap of a twig. It was peaceful but also a little lonely. I didn't mind that. The silence helped me breathe again. The next morning I woke early. The sun filtered through the trees in golden streaks. I walked down to the lake, just a few hundred feet from the cabin. The water was cold and clear, reflecting the sky and the towering pines. I dipped my hand in and felt the chill. I spent the day exploring the nearby trails, noting where berries grew and where the ground was soft with moss. I saw tracks, deer mostly, but something else too, bigger, harder to tell. I felt watched sometimes, but that was probably my mind playing tricks, I thought. For the next few days, I settled into a quiet routine. Morning walks to the lake, collecting firewood, reading books, writing a little in my notebook. Nights were spent by the fire, the only light in the black woods. The generator would hum briefly around midnight, but mostly I relied on lanterns and candles. The isolation was strange but not unpleasant. I felt myself slowing down, my heartbeat steadying. On the fourth day, something changed. I was out gathering firewood near a steep slope a few hundred yards from the cabin when I noticed strange markings on the trees. At first, they looked like scratches, deep gouges in the bark, some crossed with strange lines. They were fresh, the wood beneath still pale and raw. I couldn't make sense of them. They didn't look like animal claw marks, and they didn't match anything I'd ever seen before. A creeping sense of unease settled in my chest. I dropped the sticks I was carrying and stared at the marks for a long time. I thought about going back to the cabin, but a part of me was curious. I followed the trail of marked trees uphill. The ground was rocky and uneven, and the trees grew thicker. The scratches became more frequent, some wrapped in tight spirals around the trunks, others carved into crude shapes that vaguely resembled symbols or letters. As I walked, the forest grew quieter. No birds sang, no wind stirred the leaves. The heavy silence pressed in on me. I stopped several times, listening for any sound. My own breathing, a distant animal, anything. But there was only stillness. Suddenly, I heard a faint crunch of leaves behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but saw nothing except the dense trees and shadows. My pulse quickened, and I forced myself to calm down. It was probably just a squirrel or some other small animal. I made my way back to the cabin quickly, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with every step. When I reached the porch, I locked the door and double-checked the windows. I sat by the fire, trying to shake off the unease, but the scratches haunted my mind. Who or what could have made those marks? Why here? That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside the cabin, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, made me jump. I kept the lantern lit and the fireplace burning. I listened for the generator's hum, but it didn't come. On the fifth day, I decided to explore further around the slope where I found the marks. I wanted to understand what I had stumbled upon. I packed some food, my knife, and a small first aid kit just in case. I left the cabin mid-morning. As I walked back to the marked trees, I noticed fresh footprints in the dirt, large, heavy, with a shape that was human but too big to be mine. They led toward the deeper woods. The prints were too large for any normal person, and the stride was long and steady, like whoever made them had been walking here often. I followed them slowly, trying to keep calm. The forest thickened, and the canopy blocked out most of the sun. After about half a mile, the trail opened into a small clearing. In the middle was a crudely built wooden structure. It looked like a rough shelter, maybe made recently. The wood was fresh, not weathered like the trees around it. There were signs of fire, charred logs, ash. I crouched behind a fallen tree and observed. I saw no one, but it was clear someone had been here, maybe living here for a while. There were empty cans, scraps of cloth, and what looked like food wrappers scattered near the fire pit. Whoever this was, they weren't just passing through. The feeling of unease turned into something colder, sharper. I wondered why no one else had found this place. Was this person dangerous? Homeless? Lost? I took some pictures with my old camera, careful not to make noise, then decided to leave. The sun was already low, and I didn't want to be out here after dark. Back at the cabin, I locked up and checked my supplies. I felt the cabin's walls closing in, and I realized I wasn't just out here for peace anymore. I was out here with something unknown. That night, the wind picked up, and the roof creaked louder than before. I heard faint noises outside, branches scraping, footsteps maybe. I kept the lantern close, gripping my knife. The noises stopped and started again several times, each time closer to the cabin. I stayed awake, heart racing, waiting for something that never came. The next morning, I noticed something alarming. The front porch was disturbed, footprints in the soft earth, large and heavy again. They led away into the woods. Someone had been here outside my door. I was certain of it. For the next 2 days, I stayed inside during the day, only going out at dusk to gather wood, always armed and alert. The markings on the trees increased around the cabin, almost like warnings. More symbols scratched into bark, trees bent or broken in strange ways. I realized I was not alone. Something or someone was living in these woods, watching, marking, maybe protecting their territory. But it wasn't a ghost or a legend. It was a person, someone who didn't want me here. On the 7th day, just before dawn, I woke to a loud banging on the cabin door. My heart froze. I hid behind the door with my knife. The banging stopped, then a low grinding sound followed. Something heavy was pushed against the door. I heard breathing, deep, slow, steady, the kind of breathing a large man might have. I waited for a long time, silent and still. Eventually, the sound stopped. When I finally looked outside, there was nothing but fresh footprints leading away, disappearing into the darkness. I knew then I couldn't stay. The cabin, the forest, the quiet had all turned into a trap. I packed everything quickly, my hands shaking. I didn't want to look back. By the time the sun was fully up, I was driving back down the gravel road. The city noise was already starting to fill the air on the radio, and I welcomed it. The woods stayed behind me, silent and secret. I never found out who had made those marks or who had been living in that shelter. The police didn't take me seriously when I told them about it. They said it was probably a homeless person or maybe someone hiding from the law. But I know what I felt. Something real, dangerous, and very human. That trip taught me that the wild isn't just empty space or peaceful nature. It can be a place where people live hidden, unseen, and sometimes watching. And sometimes it's best to leave it that way. It was the summer of 1998, and I was 27 years old when I decided to take a break from my usual life in the city and head into the wilderness for some solitude. I found a small cabin to rent in the remote forests of northern Minnesota, near a tiny town called Willow Creek. The cabin was tucked deep in the woods, far from any neighbors or roads. The only way to get there was by a rough dirt trail that twisted through thick pine trees and patches of wild blueberry bushes. The idea was to spend a full 2 weeks alone, away from work, phones, and people, just me and the silence of the forest. I had been working nonstop for months at a small software company in Minneapolis, stuck in front of a computer all day, and the stress was getting to me. The city noise, the crowded subway, the endless meetings, it all felt suffocating. I needed to breathe, to clear my head, and to find something real. I wanted to be away from everything for a while, just living simply, cooking over a fire, reading and hiking. The cabin itself was old but sturdy. Built in the early 1960s, it was a single-story wooden structure with faded green paint peeling off the walls. It sat beside a small lake called Mirror Lake, named so because the water was usually so still it reflected the sky perfectly. The cabin had a stone fireplace, a small kitchen with a propane stove, a tiny bathroom with a hand pump for water, and a loft with a bed. There was no electricity, no running water except for the lake and a hand pump well outside. It was basic, but it had everything I needed. The first day I arrived, I felt a rush of excitement mixed with unease. I parked my old blue Toyota near the trailhead and hauled my backpack and a heavy cooler filled with food down the path to the cabin. The forest was thick with tall spruce and pine trees. The air smelled like earth and resin, and the ground was soft with pine needles. Birds chirped overhead, and I spotted a couple of squirrels darting between the branches. When I reached the cabin, I set down my gear and took a long look around. The lake stretched out in front of me, calm and clear, surrounded by the dense forest. There were no sounds of cars or planes, just the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the occasional call of a loon somewhere far away. I opened the cabin door, and the smell of old wood mixed with faint mildew hit me. Dust particles floated in the sunlight coming through the windows. Inside, the cabin was cold and quiet. I went straight to the fireplace and stacked some dry logs from a nearby pile. I lit a fire and watched the flames crackle and pop, feeling a little better already. I unpacked my food, mostly canned beans, rice, dried fruit, and some fresh vegetables I bought from the last town I passed through. I boiled water on the stove for coffee and settled down in a wooden chair by the window. That first night, I lay in the loft bed under a thick wool blanket. The silence was intense. Without city noise to mask the sounds, every rustle of leaves, every creak of wood, and every bird call felt amplified. At times, I thought I heard footsteps outside the cabin, but when I looked, there was nothing but shadows cast by moonlight filtering through the trees. The next morning, I woke early and went to the lake. The water was icy cold when I dipped my hands in, but refreshing. I rinsed my face and drank some fresh water from the well pump outside. The day was clear and warm, with a gentle breeze moving the tops of the trees. I spent the day hiking along the shore, finding wild berries, and marking trails on a map I brought. Over the next few days, I settled into a routine. I woke with the sun, cooked simple meals over the fire, read old paperbacks I brought, and spent hours walking through the woods or sitting by the lake. I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. The forest was alive in its quiet way. Birds built nests, insects buzzed, and the wind whispered through the branches. But as the days went on, I began to notice small things that unsettled me. The first was the footprints. One morning after a rainstorm, I saw strange footprints in the mud near the lake shore. Not mine. They looked like boots but older, worn down, as if someone had walked there recently. The prints led from the trees to the water and then disappeared. I checked my map, trying to figure out if there were any other cabins or houses nearby. According to the map, no one else was supposed to be close. The nearest town was miles away, and no trails led directly here except the one I came down. Still, I felt like I wasn't alone. The next evening, I was sitting by the fire when I heard a branch snap not far from the cabin. My heart jumped, and I sat very still, listening. There was a faint rustling in the bushes, then silence. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I started to notice odd things inside the cabin too. One morning, my coffee cup was in a different spot than I remembered leaving it. A small tool I had put on the table was missing for a few hours and then found on the floor. Nothing seemed to be damaged or broken, just little signs that someone or something had been moving around when I wasn't paying attention. By the 6th day, I felt nervous enough to keep a large kitchen knife close to me at all times. I also started locking the cabin door, even though I didn't know who I was locking out. My phone had no signal, so I couldn't call for help or check messages. I thought about leaving, but a part of me was stubborn. I wanted to prove I could handle this alone. On the 7th day, the unease grew. I woke before dawn and noticed fresh footprints in the soft ground near the cabin's back door. They were bigger than mine, and they led into the woods, then stopped abruptly. I spent the day watching the edge of the forest from the cabin window, but I didn't see anyone. That night, I didn't sleep well. The wind picked up, and the trees groaned and rattled in the darkness. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud bang against the cabin wall. It sounded like something heavy hitting the wood. I froze, listening. Silence. I grabbed the knife and moved cautiously toward the door, trying to keep quiet. Outside, the forest was pitch black except for a faint glow from the stars. I looked around but saw nothing. The smell of damp earth and pine was thick. I stayed by the door for a long time, waiting, but no more sounds came. Eventually, I went back to bed but couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching. The next day, I found fresh footprints again. This time, they led to the lake's edge and then followed the shoreline, disappearing into the trees on the other side. I tried not to panic, but my hands shook as I gathered my things. I made a decision to leave the cabin the following morning. That night, I barely slept. I kept the fire low and the knife within reach. Around midnight, I heard movement outside, slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. I pressed myself against the wall opposite the door and tried to control my breathing. The steps stopped suddenly, then a faint scraping sound, like someone dragging something across the ground. Then silence again. I stayed awake until dawn, watching the pale light spread through the trees. When the sun finally rose, I packed everything quickly, double-checked the locks, and headed back down the trail to my car. The forest felt colder and less welcoming as I walked away. When I reached the trailhead, I locked the car doors and sat inside, breathing heavily. Back in the city, the feeling of safety returned slowly. I told myself it was probably a local hunter or a camper who didn't mean any harm. Maybe they were curious or lost. There were reports of strange men lurking around cabins in the area, but nothing ever proven. I never went back to that cabin. But sometimes, at night, when the city noise fades, I think about those footsteps in the mud and the eyes I never saw but felt watching me. And I remember that in the quiet woods, far from everything, you aren't always alone, and sometimes the scariest things are the ones you don't see. I didn't plan to spend the night in that cabin, but sometimes plans go sideways. It was late October, 2013, when I found myself deep in the forests of northern Maine, near a small town called Millinocket. I was 29 years old then, on a solo hiking trip after quitting my job in Boston. I needed space and time to think. I packed light, a backpack with some food, a basic sleeping bag, water, and a flashlight. No phone signal out there, of course. The trees stretched tall and thick, their branches bare or almost bare, the wind cold enough to bite through my jacket. I started out early that morning from a trailhead off the main highway. The trail I chose was less traveled, not marked well on any map I had. I wanted to see the real forest, untouched by crowds. The woods were quiet except for the occasional rustle of dry leaves underfoot, the distant call of a crow, and the steady rhythm of my boots on dirt and fallen twigs. The sun was already low by mid-afternoon, turning the sky an eerie orange, casting long shadows between the trees. As the day faded, I realized I had lost track of time and direction. The trail markers were faint or missing, and I wasn't sure if I had veered off the main path. My watch said it was after 5 p.m., and the forest was darkening fast. I decided to keep moving west, hoping to find a clearing or maybe a road. But instead, the woods grew thicker, the underbrush denser. The forest floor was damp, and the cold seeped through my shoes and socks. I felt a creeping unease, but told myself it was just the chill. Then I saw it. A small cabin hidden behind a cluster of pines, almost swallowed by the shadows. It wasn't marked on my map, but it looked old. Weathered wood, a sagging roof covered in moss, a chimney that looked long and used. The windows were dirty, clouded over, but I could see curtains inside, yellowed and torn. A thin trail of smoke curled faintly from the chimney, which made me hesitate. Someone had been here recently, or maybe still was. My instincts said to keep moving, but the cold was unbearable. I needed shelter for the night. I approached cautiously, scanning the surroundings for any signs of people or animals. The cabin sat at the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by thick trees that blocked the fading light. The door was closed, but not locked. The old wood creaked loudly when I pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale but dry. Dust covered most surfaces, but the place was surprisingly intact. There was a small stove with ashes cold and gray in the firebox, a rickety table with peeling paint, and a few mismatched chairs. The floorboards creaked under my feet. I found some old blankets in a cupboard and dragged them out, hoping to stay warm. I gathered some dry twigs and branches from outside and managed to light a fire in the stove using a box of matches I always carried. The flames flickered to life, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The cabin was small, maybe 10 by 15 feet, but it felt like a refuge from the cold darkness outside. As night fell, the forest outside turned black. I could hear the wind moaning through the trees and the occasional snap of a twig. Somewhere far off, an animal howled, maybe a coyote or a fox. I sat by the fire, watching the flames, feeling the warmth on my face. I thought about my job back in Boston, the people I left behind, the mess I was trying to escape. Suddenly, I heard a faint noise outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was just the wind rattling the old windows, but then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching on the dead leaves. My heart jumped. I stood up, the firelight making my shadow stretch tall on the opposite wall. I grabbed a heavy piece of firewood, ready to defend myself if I had to. The footsteps circled the cabin, slow and careful. No shouting, no calls, just the sound of someone walking around. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to stay calm, listening closely. The cabin door shook slightly as if someone pushed it, but it didn't open. I whispered to myself that maybe it was a hunter or a lost traveler like me, but the silence and the slow steps didn't feel right. After what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, the footsteps retreated into the darkness. I stayed awake for most of the night, the fire dying down, the cabin cold again. I thought about what I would do if whoever was outside tried to get in again. I wished I had a phone or a weapon. Morning came with a faint light through the grimy windows. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the clearing. The footprints in the soft earth were clear, big boots, heavy tread. They didn't circle back, just walked around and then disappeared into the forest. Whoever it was, they were alone. I packed my things quickly, deciding to leave the cabin behind. But as I moved back into the woods, I kept hearing faint noises, snapping branches, whispers of movement. I stayed alert, walking briskly, trying to keep the cabin in sight in case I needed to return. The forest grew brighter as the sun rose higher. I followed a faint dirt road I found that led back toward the town. Hours later, I reached a ranger station, where I reported the cabin and the strange visitor. The ranger told me that the cabin was known but abandoned for years. People occasionally squatted there, sometimes hunters, sometimes people passing through. They warned me to be careful in those woods after dark. Looking back, I understood what had kept me alert and uneasy that night. It wasn't ghosts or shadows, but the real, raw danger of being alone in the wilderness with someone else's presence unknown. Someone possibly watching, waiting, or passing through. The forest is silent most of the time, but when it isn't, it can remind you how vulnerable you really are. I left Millinocket the next day, my thoughts heavy but clearer. I had faced that cold night and the unknown footsteps, and I survived. The cabin stayed behind me, a silent witness to that night's fear and relief. It was the winter of 1998, just after the Christmas rush, when I decided to get away for a few days. I was 29 then, working in a small town in northern Vermont called Stowe. I wanted nothing more than silence, peace, and the cold air of the mountains. The city and my job were wearing me down, and I needed time to think, to reset. I rented a small cabin deep in the woods, near a place called Smuggler's Notch. It was the kind of spot you only get to if you know the back roads or have a real map. No cell signal, no internet, just forest and snow. The cabin was old, built maybe in the 1950s with thick logs and a stone chimney. It had a tiny kitchen, a small living room with a wood stove, and one bedroom with a bed that creaked when you moved. The windows were frosted over, but I could see the tall pine trees bending under the weight of fresh snow. The road to the cabin was a narrow dirt path, barely cleared, and the owner told me to be careful driving after dark. I arrived just as the sun was setting. The sky was a pale orange, fading quickly into gray. I brought a backpack with essentials: canned food, a few books, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and plenty of warm clothes. The cabin smelled like old pine and wood smoke, but clean. I felt the weight of the silence settle in around me like a heavy blanket. The first night, I made a fire in the wood stove, heating the small room while snow quietly fell outside. The crackling of the flames was the only sound apart from the wind brushing against the cabin walls. I cooked some soup on the stove, ate slowly, and then went to bed early. The cold crept into the cabin overnight despite the stove, making me pull the thick blankets tighter around me. The next morning, I woke to a world coated in snow. The trees were white, the path outside invisible. I went outside with my boots and coat, stepping carefully on the crust of frozen snow. The air was sharp and clean. I wandered through the woods a bit, taking in the quiet. No birds, no animals, just snow crunching beneath my feet. By the afternoon, I realized the weather was getting worse. The wind picked up, throwing snow in wild sheets that blurred my vision. The sky turned a dull, heavy gray. I checked the small radio I'd brought along, hoping for a weather update, but there was nothing but static. I didn't have cell service here, and the nearest town was over 15 miles away. I started to feel uneasy, but I told myself the cabin was safe. It was built for winter. I went back inside, stacked more wood in the stove, and made another fire. Outside, the storm began in earnest. Snow fell thick and fast, piling up against the windows. The wind howled like a wild animal. I pulled my chair close to the stove and tried to read, but the cold seeped in where the window frames didn't seal perfectly. That night, the power went out. I knew that would happen eventually. The cabin ran on a small generator, but with the storm, the fuel line must have frozen. I found my flashlight and lit a few candles. The flames flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. The silence was absolute except for the roar of the wind outside. That was when I heard it. First, I thought it was just the wind, a scraping, slow and deliberate, coming from the side of the cabin. I froze and listened. It sounded like someone, or something, was trying to move the snow away from the wall. A scratch here, a soft scrape there. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a fox trapped in the snow. But the sound kept coming, steady and patient. It lasted for maybe 5 minutes before stopping. I waited longer, heart pounding. Nothing. I decided to check outside. I grabbed my coat and flashlight and carefully stepped into the snow. The wind hit me like a wall, biting cold and blinding snowflakes. I circled the cabin, shining the light on the snowbank near the side door. There, I saw fresh footprints in the snow, not from any animal I recognized. They were human. My throat went dry. I scanned the dark woods around the cabin, but no one was there. No sounds except the wind and the distant creak of trees bending in the storm. I hurried back inside, locking the doors and windows. The thought that someone could be outside in the storm, so close to me, made my skin crawl. I had no idea who it could be or what they wanted. The next day, the storm was worse. Snow drifted up to the roof, the wind screaming constantly. I rationed my food carefully, drinking only small sips of water I melted from snow over the stove. I stayed close to the fire, wrapped in blankets, my mind spinning with worry. What if the person outside came back? What if the storm cut me off here for days? Around mid-afternoon, I heard it again. This time it was louder, something banging against the cabin walls, trying to get in. I froze in terror. My heart hammered as I moved quietly to the kitchen, grabbing a heavy cast iron skillet. I held it like a weapon, even though I knew it wouldn't do much. The banging stopped after a few minutes, but then I heard footsteps crunching away through the snow, heading toward the back of the cabin where the woods were thickest. I waited, tense and silent. That night I couldn't sleep. Every noise made me jump. The wind, the snow falling from the roof, branches scraping the windows. I stayed awake, clutching the skillet, listening. The next morning, I saw tracks outside, barely visible under fresh snow, but they were still there. They showed someone had walked around the cabin during the night. My stomach twisted. I had to do something. I knew I couldn't stay here forever. The road was blocked by snowdrifts at least 6 feet high, and the storm wasn't stopping. No one knew I was here except the cabin owner, and they didn't come by during winter. That afternoon, as the storm eased for a moment, I decided to try and hike out. I packed what little food I had left, filled my water bottle, and took my thickest coat and boots. I left a note on the table just in case. Stepping outside was like walking into a wall of cold. The snow was knee-deep and the wind still whipped. I followed the faintest trail I could find leading away from the cabin toward the main road. Hours passed. My legs burned, and my face stung from the cold. I kept telling myself to keep going, to stay calm. But the forest was quiet in a way that made my skin crawl. No birds, no animals, no signs of life. After about 3 miles, I stopped to rest. I was exhausted and cold to the bone. As I sat on a fallen log, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, steady. My heart stopped. I turned around slowly, shining my flashlight in the direction the sound came from. There was a man standing maybe 30 feet away, half covered in snow, wearing a dark coat and a knit cap. His face was hard to see in the dim light. He didn't say anything, just stared. Fear hit me like a truck. I gripped my flashlight tight and backed away. He started walking toward me. I turned and ran, stumbling through the snow. My breath came out in painful gasps. I had no idea where I was going, just away from him. The snow swallowed my footprints as I ran, and soon I was lost. I kept running until my legs gave out, and I collapsed in the snow. The man caught up, grabbed me roughly by the arm, and dragged me to my feet. I struggled, but his grip was iron. He pushed me toward a dark thicket. I felt hopeless, cold, and scared beyond anything I'd ever known. Then something unexpected happened. A loud noise rang out. A shout from far away, and the man froze. He looked around, panic in his eyes, and then he ran off into the woods, disappearing like a shadow. I was left alone, shivering and trembling, but alive. I waited, listening for any sign of him returning. After an hour, I slowly made my way back to the cabin, following the faint trail I had left. Back inside, I locked every door and window and piled heavy furniture in front of them. I lit the fire and huddled close, exhausted and shaking. The next morning, the storm finally cleared. The sun came out weakly, lighting the snow-covered trees. I packed the last of my things, made sure the fire was out, and started the walk to the nearest road where I hoped to find help. I was lucky. After a few hours, a snowplow passed, and I flagged it down. The driver took me to the nearest town, where I called the police. They told me that the man who had tried to follow me was a local drifter, known for sneaking into cabins and causing trouble. They caught him later that day, hiding in an abandoned shed near the road. That experience stayed with me for years. The fear, the cold, the silence of the woods, and the knowledge that sometimes the scariest things are not monsters or ghosts, but real people in desperate situations. I never went back to that cabin, but I'm grateful I made it out. I learned that survival isn't just about fighting the weather or being strong. It's about keeping your wits, trusting your instincts, and holding on to hope, even when everything seems lost. The sky was a dull gray when I pulled off the highway onto the winding dirt road that led to the cabin. It was October 2003, early autumn, and I had taken a week off work to get away from the city. I was 28, living alone in Seattle, and desperate for a break from the noise, the rush, the constant hum of life that left me exhausted but restless. The cabin was a rental, deep in the woods of northern Oregon, about a 2-hour drive from Portland. I had found it online, an old wooden structure sitting on the edge of a thick forest near a small, quiet lake. The first thing I noticed when I arrived was the smell. It was a mix of wet wood, damp earth, and something faintly like smoke, like the cabin had been closed up for a long time and was only now waking up. The dirt road ended in a small clearing where the cabin stood, surrounded by tall pines whose tops disappeared into a thick fog that had rolled in overnight. The cabin itself was rough but sturdy, built maybe in the 70s, with peeling brown paint and a sagging porch. The windows were dusty, clouded with grime and spiderwebs. I parked my car next to the porch and grabbed my backpack and cooler. The air was cold, the kind that creeps through your jacket and makes you aware of every small breath you take. Inside, the cabin smelled of stale air and old wood. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the walls were lined with wood paneling that had yellowed with age. There was a small kitchen area with a propane stove, a worn-out table with 2 chairs, and a living space with a threadbare couch and a fireplace full of cold ashes. I dropped my bags and went to the windows, looking out into the forest. The fog had thickened, blurring the trees and hiding the lake from view. The cabin had no cell signal, no internet, and no TV, exactly what I wanted. I was here to disconnect, to find some peace. After unpacking my things, I went to explore the surroundings. A narrow path led from the back of the cabin down to the lake. The water was still, dark, and cold-looking. Leaves floated on its surface, and the air was so quiet I could hear the faint splash of a fish breaking the water far away. I spent the day unpacking, chopping some wood for the fireplace, and trying to get comfortable. The cabin was simple but had what I needed: a bed, a small bathroom with a shower, and a wood stove to heat the place if it got too cold at night. As evening came, the fog grew thicker and crept closer to the cabin. I lit the stove, filling the room with a faint smell of smoke and warmth. Outside, the woods were alive with sounds: rustling leaves, distant birds, the occasional snap of a twig. It was calming but also made me aware of how isolated I was. No other houses, no people, nothing but trees stretching for miles. I cooked some canned soup on the stove and ate quietly by the window. The light inside the cabin was dim, casting long shadows on the walls. Outside, the fog seemed to press against the glass, softening the edges of the trees and hiding the world beyond. That night, I lay awake for a while, listening to the sounds outside. The wind whispered through the branches, and at one point, I heard a low, distant howl. Maybe a coyote or a wolf. It wasn't frightening, just a reminder of the wildness surrounding me. I fell asleep with the stove warming the room and the fog wrapping the cabin like a blanket. The next day was clear, bright with sunlight piercing through the trees. I decided to hike deeper into the forest, taking the path that followed the edge of the lake. The trail was narrow, lined with ferns and moss-covered rocks, and the ground was soft underfoot. I saw deer tracks in the mud and the occasional squirrel darting through the branches. I carried a small backpack with water, a flashlight, and a map I had printed before coming. The map wasn't very detailed, but showed the main paths and a few landmarks, including an old logging road not far from the cabin. As I walked, I noticed something strange. Old, rusted metal objects half buried in the dirt. Fragments of wire, parts of machinery, and broken glass. It looked like someone had been here years ago, maybe for logging or mining. The forest was reclaiming it all, but the signs of human activity were faint but there. After a couple of hours, I reached a clearing with an old foundation made of large stones, maybe the remains of a cabin or small building. The wood was long gone, but nails and bits of broken glass were scattered around. I walked through carefully, noticing how the area was overgrown with weeds and vines. The silence here was heavier, almost like the forest was holding its breath. I didn't stay long and headed back before the sun got too low. When I got back to the cabin, the fog had returned, thicker than before. The woods looked darker, the trees more like black shadows. I lit the stove again and tried to relax with a book, but my thoughts kept drifting. That night, I heard something outside. It wasn't the usual forest noises. It was a faint, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled over the ground. It was slow and deliberate. I stayed still, listening, but I couldn't see anything through the window except the dense fog. The sound stopped after a few minutes, and the forest went silent again. I told myself it was probably a fallen branch or an animal moving through the undergrowth. Still, it made me a little uneasy. The next morning, I found marks outside near the edge of the clearing. Deep grooves in the dirt, like something heavy had been dragged across the ground. They led into the forest, disappearing between the trees. The grooves were fresh. The earth was still loose. I spent the day checking the perimeter, but I didn't see any other signs. The forest was quiet, and the cabin looked the same, but the feeling of being watched was growing. I kept the windows closed tight and kept a small hatchet near the door. The third night was worse. The dragging sound returned, louder this time, closer. It circled the cabin slowly, stopping sometimes, then moving again. I didn't dare open the door or look outside. I stayed huddled near the stove, the hatchet in my hand, the cabin dark except for the small orange glow. At one point, the dragging stopped just outside the door. I could hear heavy breathing, low and slow. My heart pounded. After a long silence, the sound moved away, fading into the forest. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I noticed the back door had a long scratch mark, like claws trying to tear through the wood. The scratches were deep, jagged, and fresh. There was dirt and some hair stuck in the marks, coarse, dark, not human. Fear hit me hard, but I stayed calm. I knew the cabin was isolated, but it had a door and windows. I checked my supplies and decided I needed to get out the next day. That afternoon, I made sure the car was ready, packed everything, and prepared for the drive back. I wanted to leave before nightfall. As evening came, the fog was almost thick enough to cut with a knife. The sounds outside were different now. Low growls, rustling that was faster and more purposeful. I sat near the window, watching the dark forest, waiting for the last light. Then I heard it. A deep growl, low and long, coming from just beyond the porch. I grabbed the hatchet and slowly stepped outside, the cold air biting my skin. The fog was so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the mist. Suddenly, movement caught my eye, two glowing eyes staring at me from the edge of the clearing. The creature was large, much bigger than any dog or wolf I had seen. Its fur was matted, dark, and wet, and its teeth glinted in the dim light. I backed toward the cabin, heart racing. The animal didn't move but growled again, low and threatening. I slammed the door shut and locked it. I could hear it pacing outside, its heavy breathing and low growls pressing against the wood. I turned on the porch light, hoping to scare it away, but the creature just stopped and stared, unmoved. Night fell fully, and the cabin felt like a small island in a sea of danger. I stayed by the window, watching the shadows move, ready to defend myself. Morning came with a thin, weak sun. The creature was gone, but outside the porch were deep paw prints, big and muddy. I wasted no time. I packed the last things, started the car, and drove away, not looking back. The road was long and winding, but the feeling of relief grew with every mile. The forest stayed behind me, dense and silent. When I got home, I called the rental company and told them about what happened. They said the area was known for a large population of wild bears, and sometimes one or two got bold enough to come near cabins. Looking back, I realized the dragging sounds, the scratches, the growls. It was a bear, maybe a big male, territorial and desperate for food before winter. It wasn't a ghost or a myth. It was nature, wild and real, and I had been lucky to get away safe. The experience taught me how quickly the wilderness could turn from peaceful to dangerous. I still think about that cabin, the quiet lake, and the foggy nights, but now I know respect for the forest means knowing what lives there. Not just in stories, but in real. It was early October 1998 when I decided to escape the city for a week. I was 26 years old then, living alone in a small apartment in Portland, Oregon. Work had been eating me alive, and the constant noise of the city, the cars, the people, the sirens, made my head feel like it was going to split open. I needed a break, something quiet, somewhere I could be alone with my thoughts, without interruptions. So, I found a cabin listed in a small local paper ad, tucked away near Mount Hood National Forest, about an hour and a half outside the city. The cabin was simple but sturdy, built decades ago by a man named James who had passed it down to a distant relative who was renting it out. It was a wooden structure with a stone chimney and a front porch big enough to sit on with a coffee mug and watch the trees sway. The owner said it was isolated, no neighbors within a mile or two. Perfect for getting away, they said. No distractions, no noise, just nature. I packed what I thought I would need: clothes, a few books, food, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and my old camera. I left on a chilly Sunday morning, the sky overcast, the kind of gray that felt like it would pour rain any second. The drive was calm, the roads narrowing as I got closer to the forest. The air changed the moment I left the highway. Cooler, crisper, scented with pine and damp earth. When I finally turned off the last dirt road and pulled up to the cabin, it felt even more remote than I expected. Trees pressed in close on all sides, tall firs and oaks with leaves just starting to turn yellow and orange. The cabin's wood was weathered but solid, its windows dusty but intact. I opened the creaky door and stepped inside. Inside, the cabin was small, about 600 square feet, with one main room that served as kitchen, living, and dining area. A narrow hallway led to a tiny bedroom and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the air smelled faintly of mothballs and old wood. A rusty wood stove sat in the corner, its black pipe rising through the ceiling. There was a stack of firewood on the porch, ready for use. I set my things down and started to explore. The kitchen was basic: a small gas stove, a single sink, a wooden table with 2 chairs. The cupboards held some old pots and pans, a few canned goods left by previous renters, and a faded instruction sheet for the stove. The bedroom had a creaky bed with a thin mattress and heavy quilts folded on top. The bathroom was clean but basic, with no hot water unless the stove was lit. I made a fire in the stove to warm the place, watching the flames dance behind the glass door. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and the occasional call of a crow broke the silence. I unpacked my camera and notebooks, planning to write, read, and relax. I wanted to live off the grid for a few days, maybe hike a bit, maybe just sit on the porch and watch the forest. The first day passed quietly. I woke early, brewed coffee on the stove, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was fresh, and the sky had cleared into a pale blue. The forest was alive with movement. Squirrels darting between branches, birds flitting from tree to tree. I put on hiking boots and headed down a narrow path behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods. The trail was soft underfoot with fallen leaves and pine needles. The forest was dense but not unwelcoming. I followed a small stream, watching water ripple over rocks, listening to the quiet sounds of the woods. I walked for a couple of hours, stopping occasionally to take pictures of moss-covered trees and mushrooms growing in damp shade. By late afternoon, I returned to the cabin feeling tired but peaceful. I built another fire and cooked a simple meal. Beans warmed in a pot, some bread I had brought. As dusk settled, the forest darkened. The cabin's windows glowed softly from the firelight inside. The sounds of the forest at night were different. An owl hooting in the distance, twigs snapping under invisible feet, the wind sighing through the leaves. I went to bed early, tired from the day's walk. The bed creaked under me, and the quilts smelled faintly of wood smoke. I was just drifting off when I thought I heard a noise outside, like something scraping gently against the cabin's side. I sat up, heart pounding, but the moonlight through the window showed nothing. Maybe a branch, maybe a deer. Sleep came slow but eventually took me. The next day was similar: a hike, a fire, reading by the window. But late in the afternoon, while I was preparing to go out again, I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt near the cabin, faint but fresh. They weren't mine, and they didn't look like animal prints. Human for sure, but small, like someone wearing light boots or sneakers. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The cabin was supposed to be isolated. No neighbors within miles. Who could be walking around here? I checked the windows and doors. Everything was locked and secure. I told myself it must be someone hiking nearby or maybe a hunter, but the thought didn't ease my nerves. I decided to stay inside that evening, keeping the fire going and the flashlight close. The wind picked up, rattling the windows. Shadows flickered against the walls. The silence outside was thick, oppressive. Around midnight, I woke again to a faint tapping on the porch roof. Just light taps, but deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight, threw on a jacket, and opened the door a crack. The porch was empty. No footprints, no animals. Only the dark woods staring back. I slammed the door shut and locked it, heart racing. I spent the rest of the night half awake, listening for any other sounds. The forest was alive with strange noises. Branches cracking, leaves rustling, something moving in the underbrush, but nothing visible. Morning came slowly. I decided to leave the cabin and head back to town that day. Something felt off, and I didn't want to spend another night there. I packed quickly and stepped outside to load my things into the car. The forest looked peaceful in daylight, but the footprints were still there, nearby the porch, leading into the trees. As I got in and started the engine, I saw movement in the corner of my eye, a figure standing between the trees watching me. I blinked, and it was gone. The drive back was tense. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting the figure to appear on the road behind me. But nothing. When I finally reached the city, the noise, the lights, the crowds felt overwhelming but safe. Days later, I called the cabin's owner. They said no one else was renting the place that week. They hadn't heard of anyone living nearby. The cabin was supposed to be empty and quiet. I never went back. The memory of those footprints, that tapping, and the figure in the trees stayed with me. A reminder that some places, even when empty, aren't as alone as you think. It was the fall of 1997 when I decided to spend a week alone in the woods. I was 28, tired of the noise and rush of city life in Seattle. I had found a small cabin for rent, tucked deep inside the Cascade Mountains, about 3 hours north from the city. The owner had described it as a quiet spot, off the grid, perfect for anyone wanting to escape. I wanted to disconnect, to breathe fresh air, and maybe do some fishing and hiking. I never thought the trip would turn into something I'd never forget, something that would haunt me for years. The cabin was a simple, old wooden structure. It sat near the edge of a dense forest, with a narrow dirt road leading to it. When I arrived late afternoon, the sun was already lowering, casting long shadows through the tall pine trees. The air smelled crisp and clean, with a hint of pine sap and earth. There was no cell phone signal, which was exactly what I wanted. The cabin had a small porch with a rocking chair, a stone chimney, and a woodpile stacked neatly by the side. Inside, the cabin was basic but cozy. There was a small kitchen with a wood stove, a table, and a couple of chairs. A tiny living room with a couch covered in old, faded fabric, a bookshelf with some old paperbacks, and a simple bed in the corner. The windows were thick and small, with curtains that had seen better days. Everything was dusty, but it smelled clean, like the cabin had been closed up for months. I unpacked my bags and lit a fire in the stove, enjoying the warmth spreading through the room. The first couple of days were peaceful. I went on hikes, fishing at the nearby stream, and just sat outside watching the forest move with the wind. At night, the woods were alive with the sounds of animals, birds, crickets, and the occasional distant howl of a coyote. It was the silence I craved, only broken by nature's voice. On the third night, things started to feel different. I had gone to bed early, tired from a long day of walking. The fire in the stove was low, casting soft, flickering shadows on the wooden walls. I was just drifting off when I heard a noise outside, sharp and sudden, like a heavy branch snapping. I froze, heart pounding, listening. But after a minute, nothing else. No footsteps, no rustling. Just silence again. I told myself it was probably a deer or some animal moving through the underbrush, but the sound felt too close. I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and went out onto the porch. The night was cold, the stars bright overhead. I swept the light over the trees, the woodpile, the path. Nothing moved. No signs of anyone or anything. Still, I locked the door and went back inside, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The next day, I kept checking the surroundings more carefully. I noticed something odd. A few broken twigs on the path leading to the cabin, and some footprints in the mud. They weren't deer tracks. They looked like human footprints, small and shallow, as if someone had walked lightly. I followed them a bit, but they disappeared into the thick forest. That night, I heard the snapping sound again, louder this time, closer. And then something else, a low scrape like someone dragging a heavy bag or moving something on the ground. My stomach twisted. I stayed up most of the night, sitting by the fire, flashlight in hand, staring out the window. On the fourth day, I found more signs. The woodpile was disturbed. Logs shifted, some smaller sticks broken. Nothing was missing, but it was clear someone had been there. I told myself maybe it was some campers or hikers passing by, though the road was barely used. Still, the thought of strangers around made me uneasy. That afternoon, I went deeper into the woods than before. I wanted to see if I could spot any other cabins or signs of people nearby. After about 2 hours walking, I found an old, abandoned fire pit. Around it were bits of rusted cans and a smashed lantern. The place looked forgotten, but fresh footprints surrounded it, too. I could see from the tracks they were small, like the ones near the cabin. On the way back, I felt eyes on me. I kept looking behind at every rustle and shadow. I didn't run, but my pace quickened. When I finally saw the cabin's roof through the trees, relief washed over me. That night, I barely slept. Every noise outside made me jump. I thought about leaving the next day, but the car was parked miles down the road, and the weather was turning cold. Couldn't just walk out. On the 5th day, the feeling of being watched got worse. I found something new that morning. A bundle of sticks, tied together with a piece of twine, placed neatly on the porch railing. It was weird, like a crude symbol or marker. I didn't touch it. I looked around, but no one was in sight. The day passed slowly. I stayed mostly inside, chopping firewood to keep warm, but every so often, I'd glance toward the tree line, expecting to see a figure. That night, I was almost certain I saw a shadow moving just beyond the edge of the clearing. It was quick, barely a flicker. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside onto the porch. The beam scanned the dark forest, stopping on a pair of eyes reflecting back at me from about 30 feet away. I froze. The eyes blinked once and vanished. My heart hammered, my hands shook. I slammed the door and locked it tight, pushing a chair against it for good measure. I sat down, trying to steady my breath. The rest of the night passed in restless silence. The next morning, I woke to find the door had been scratched. The wood was gouged in several places, deep enough to feel with my fingers. The scratches looked fresh, like a desperate attempt to get in. I didn't sleep all night. That day, I packed up everything. I wanted to leave immediately, but the car was still down the road. I tried the phone again, no signal. I considered hiking back, but the trail was rough and long. I decided to drive to the nearest ranger station, which was about 10 miles down a side road. I gathered my things, put on my coat, and carefully stepped outside. The air was cold and dry. As I moved around, I kept looking over my shoulder. I left the cabin quickly, locking the door as best I could. The dirt road was bumpy and winding, flanked by dense forest on both sides. I kept my eyes peeled, but saw nothing. After about 20 minutes, I reached the ranger station. It was small and quiet, with a single old truck parked outside. I knocked on the door and waited. When someone finally answered, I explained my situation as best I could. They listened carefully, and then told me there had been reports of poachers and trespassers in the area. People using the forest illegally for hunting and camping, sometimes threatening to anyone who caught them. I felt a mix of anger and relief. I wasn't alone in sensing something was wrong. They agreed to send a ranger with me back to the cabin to check the place. When we arrived, the ranger looked serious. We checked the cabin thoroughly. There were more signs of intrusion, footprints, disturbed firewood, and the tied stick bundle. The ranger explained it was probably a warning or some kind of mark from the trespassers to let others know the cabin was occupied or watched. I stayed with the ranger overnight in the cabin, and we took turns staying awake. The next day, they arranged for me to be escorted back to my car. Before leaving, I took one last look at the cabin. It sat quietly among the trees, peaceful in appearance but hiding something darker beneath. The experience left me shaken, but also wiser. Nature is beautiful, but it's also unpredictable. And sometimes, it's not the wild animals you need to fear, it's other people. I never went back to that cabin. I've heard the area has since been patrolled more often to keep trespassers away. But every time I think about that week, I remember the feeling of being watched in the dark, the scratches on the door, and the eyes glowing in the night. It taught me that safety isn't just about the place you're in, but the people around you. And sometimes, the scariest thing is the unknown presence just beyond the tree line, watching quietly and waiting. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. It was late October, 2019, and I had finally gotten some time off work to spend a week alone in the woods, away from the noise and stress of the city. I was 32 years old, living in Portland, Oregon, and I chose a small cabin deep in the Mount Hood National Forest. The cabin wasn't fancy, just a small wooden structure built decades ago, with a wood stove, a few old pieces of furniture, and a kitchen that barely worked. But it was perfect for what I needed: silence, isolation, and time to think. I arrived just as the sun was setting, the sky painted in shades of orange and purple behind the towering pine trees. The air was crisp and smelled like wet earth and pine needles. The drive-in had been bumpy and long, gravel roads weaving through thick forest. I parked my old Subaru a little way from the cabin, near a trailhead that led to a small frozen creek. The ground was damp from an early snowfall that had melted in the afternoon sun, leaving patches of mud. The cabin sat on a slight rise, with a small porch that creaked underfoot. I unlocked the door with a metal key I'd picked up from the caretaker's place in the nearby town of Government Camp. The inside smelled of wood smoke and mustiness, the kind that comes from a place closed up during the summer. I flipped on the old overhead light, which flickered for a moment before steadying. The cabin had a single main room with a small kitchen area along one wall, a table covered with dust, and 2 rickety chairs. A narrow staircase led to a loft above where the bed was. I dropped my pack on the floor, pulled off my boots, and opened the windows to let in the cold air. Outside, the forest was already darkening, shadows growing longer between the trees. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves, the occasional bird call, and the distant creak of branches swaying in the wind. That first night, I built a fire in the stove. The wood was dry enough, and soon the cabin was warm and filled with the smell of burning pine. I cooked some canned soup over the stove and ate quietly, feeling the calm settle over me. Outside, the wind picked up and whispered through the trees, but inside I felt safe and snug. I had brought a stack of books and planned to spend my days hiking the trails, reading by the fire, and simply being alone. For years, life had been busy and messy. Work deadlines, crowded city streets, noisy neighbors, and endless small problems. I needed this escape, this break from everything. The first few days passed quietly. I rose with the sun, the light slipping between the branches and hitting the cabin windows. I made breakfast on a small camping stove, bundled up in layers because the nights were cold. During the day, I wore my hiking boots and carried a backpack with water, a map, and a small first aid kit. I explored the forest trails, careful of the slippery ground and fallen leaves. One afternoon, while walking near the creek, I noticed something strange on the trail. A few feet off the path, partially covered in leaves and dirt, were footprints. They looked fresh, too fresh for any animal and definitely not mine. The prints were large, maybe a man's boots, but something about the shape seemed off. The edges were sharp and clear, as if someone had stepped there only minutes before. I froze for a moment, listening. The forest was quiet except for the water trickling in the creek and the wind in the trees. No voices, no footsteps. Nothing else to tell me I was not alone. But that didn't feel right. I hadn't seen a single person since I arrived, and the nearest cabin was miles away. I traced the prints carefully. They followed the trail for a short distance before veering into the trees. I thought about calling someone on my phone, but I had little to no signal here. The cabin's landline didn't work either. The old wires probably cut during a storm. I felt a chill not from the cold but from uncertainty. Someone else was nearby, close enough to leave fresh footprints. But who? Why hadn't I seen or heard them? I tried to brush the feeling aside, telling myself it was probably a hunter or a ranger checking the trails. That night, I kept the fire burning longer, the orange glow pushing back the dark corners of the cabin. Every small noise outside made me tense. A branch snapping, the distant hoot of an owl, the low rustle of something moving through the underbrush. I checked the windows multiple times, expecting to see a figure standing just beyond the tree line. But there was nothing, just the dark forest. I didn't sleep well. Every time I dozed off, I'd wake to some noise or an uneasy feeling crawling over my skin. The wind howled harder as the night wore on, shaking the cabin's walls. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps on the porch, but when I looked, the porch was empty. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the trees stood like silent sentinels, watching. Morning brought no relief. The footprints were still there, outside the cabin door, pressed deep into the wet earth. Whoever had been here wasn't gone yet. I wanted to leave, but the road out was muddy and difficult, and my car was parked too far to reach quickly. Over the next days, the feeling of being watched never left me. I found more signs: broken branches near the trail, small piles of stones stacked oddly, as if someone was marking their path or leaving messages. I saw no one, but the signs were there, constant and growing. One afternoon, while gathering firewood, I heard a noise behind me. Twigs snapping, soft shuffling. I turned quickly but saw nothing but thick bushes and trees. The forest was alive with sound, but this was different, too deliberate. I gripped my axe tightly and moved toward the cabin, trying to keep calm. Back inside, I locked the door and barred the windows with whatever I could find. The cabin suddenly felt small and fragile, like a fragile shell against the vastness outside. I started to realize that I was not alone, and that whoever had been following me wasn't planning to reveal themselves easily. That night was the worst. Around midnight, the wind stopped completely, and an unnatural silence filled the forest. Then, from outside, came slow, heavy footsteps circling the cabin. The crunch of boots in dirt, the scraping of something against the wood siding. I stayed frozen, barely breathing, trying to make out any shapes through the thin curtains. The footsteps moved to the porch and stopped. A faint shadow passed under the window. I could almost see the outline of a person, standing still and watching. My heart pounded so loud I thought it would break my ribs. Minutes stretched like hours. Then the footsteps moved away, circling the cabin again, slower now, almost like the person was hesitating. Finally, they faded into the woods. The next morning, I found marks on the cabin door. Deep scratches and dents, like someone had tried to force it open. My blood ran cold. Whoever was out there wanted in. I packed my things quickly, deciding I couldn't stay another night. I didn't know who was out there or why, but I knew it wasn't safe. The idea of walking through the woods alone with that person nearby was terrifying. The drive back was tense. I kept the windows rolled up and doors locked, glancing nervously into the dark trees along the road. When I finally reached the town, the normal noise of traffic and people felt like a shield. I stopped at the local sheriff's office and reported what I had seen. The sheriff listened carefully, taking notes. He told me that sometimes hunters or other people stayed hidden in the woods, but that no one had reported anything dangerous recently. Still, he promised to send someone out to check the area. A week later, I heard from the sheriff again. They had searched around the cabin and found signs of someone living rough in the woods nearby. An old campsite, some discarded food cans, a crude shelter made from branches and tarp. No one had been arrested, and the person had apparently moved on, but they had left behind trash and signs of their presence close to the cabin. I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. I wasn't dealing with anything supernatural or magical, just another human being trying to survive in the forest. But the fear of that unknown presence had stayed with me long after I left. I never went back to that cabin. Instead, I took trips to more populated campsites, where there were other people around and the chances of encountering someone unknown were smaller. The forest is beautiful, but it's also wild and unpredictable. Sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're other people, and the quiet, empty spaces where they can hide and watch without being seen. That week in the cabin taught me that safety is never guaranteed, and sometimes you have to listen to your gut and get out before things get worse. I never thought a quiet weekend away would turn into something I'd never forget. It was the fall of 1997 when I decided to rent that cabin deep in the woods of northern Vermont. I was 28 at the time, working in a small bookstore in Burlington, and I needed a break. A real break from the city noise and constant buzz of people. I'd been feeling worn down, tired like I was running on empty, and the idea of a few days with just silence and trees sounded perfect. The cabin was small, maybe 600 square feet, built decades earlier by a local family that had moved on. It stood at the edge of a clearing surrounded by thick pine and birch trees. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in a while. Weathered wood, a sagging roof, and a porch where the paint peeled off in long strips. There was a stack of firewood neatly piled by the side and an old rusty wood stove inside. The floor creaked under every step, and the windows were covered with thin curtains that let in only soft, muted light. I arrived late in the afternoon, carrying a backpack with some clothes, canned food, a lantern, and a heavy wool blanket. I unlocked the door with the key the rental agency had given me, and the smell hit me right away. A mix of damp earth, old wood, and something else I couldn't name at first. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was thick and heavy in the air, like the cabin had been sealed up for a long time. I dropped my bag by the door and walked around the small living area. There was a kitchen nook with an old sink and a gas stove that looked like it hadn't been used in years. A small wooden table stood near the window, and the single bed was tucked in the corner, covered by a faded quilt. I opened the windows to let in the fresh air and sunshine, feeling the chill of the autumn wind on my skin as the cabin slowly warmed. Outside, the forest stretched on endlessly in all directions. The trees were in full color, yellows, oranges, reds, with leaves crunching underfoot. I could see a narrow dirt road leading back to the main highway, but it was far enough that no cars passed by except for the occasional pickup truck that disappeared quickly. After unpacking, I stacked some wood into the stove and lit a fire. The smoke curled up the chimney, and the cabin began to glow with a soft warmth. I sat on the porch, wrapped in the blanket, watching the sun dip lower behind the trees. It was peaceful, just me, the forest, and the quiet. That night, after the fire burned low, I lay awake listening to the sounds outside, wind rustling through branches, the distant call of a night bird, and the occasional crack of a falling twig. I felt calm, more relaxed than I had in months. I drifted off to sleep with the window slightly open, letting the cool night air brush against my face. The next day, I planned to explore the area. I packed a small bag with water, some food, a pocket knife, and a map I'd printed from an online source. The woods were dense but beautiful, with trails winding around hills and small streams. I followed a path that led to an old abandoned logging site about 2 miles from the cabin. There were piles of rotting wood and rusty equipment half buried in moss and leaves. The ground was soft and damp, and the air smelled of pine and wet earth. I wandered further, moving quietly and carefully so I wouldn't disturb any animals. I saw a few deer tracks and some squirrels darting through the underbrush. The sun was high, and I felt good being out there, away from everything. But as the afternoon wore on, I realized I had lost track of time. The sun started to lower, and I decided to head back before it got dark. The walk back seemed longer. The trees looked different, the shadows deeper, and the path less clear. I slowed down, trying to remember landmarks, but the forest around me felt unfamiliar. I kept telling myself I was just tired and maybe a little distracted. By the time I reached the clearing near the cabin, the light was fading fast. I hurried inside, locked the door, and started a fire again. I was tired, cold, and a little shaken by how lost I'd felt. I ate a quick dinner of canned beans and crackers, then sat by the stove staring at the flames. That night was different. The wind picked up and howled around the cabin, making the walls creak and groan. I kept hearing noises, small thuds, scraping sounds against the outside walls, and something like footsteps on the porch. At first, I told myself it was just animals or the wind playing tricks, but the noises didn't stop. I got up and checked every window. All the curtains were still, the glass wasn't broken, and no footprints were in the dirt outside. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The hairs on my arms stood up, and I felt cold despite the fire. I tried to sleep but kept waking up every hour or so. Each time I heard a noise, my heart jumped. Once, I thought I saw a shadow move past the window, but when I looked closer, there was nothing there. The next morning, I decided to explore the cabin's perimeter. Maybe the noises were from animals caught or stuck nearby. I took a flashlight and stepped outside. The ground was soft from rain the night before, and the leaves were wet. I circled the cabin slowly, shining the light into every corner and bush. I found nothing unusual, no footprints except my own, no signs of animals trapped or injured, no evidence of people nearby, just the quiet forest. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Later that day, I noticed my food supply was lighter than I'd left it. A can of beans was dented, some crackers were gone, and my water bottle had less water than I remembered. I searched the cabin carefully, looking for signs of anyone else inside, but found none. No footprints on the floor, no disturbed furniture, no clues at all. That night, the noises returned, louder and more persistent. Scratches on the wood, thuds, and once, a loud bang on the door. I stayed near the stove with a heavy cast iron pan in my hand, my heart pounding. I didn't open the door, just sat there waiting for dawn. At first light, I walked down the dirt road toward the highway, hoping to find help or at least some sign of civilization. The road was empty, and I didn't see any cars for a long time. My phone had no signal, so I couldn't call anyone. As I walked, I thought about what was happening. The noises, the missing food. Maybe someone had been sneaking into the cabin without me knowing. But how? The windows were locked. The door was locked. Unless someone had a key. I didn't tell anyone where I was going when I left town. No one knew about the cabin except the rental agency. Still, I couldn't help but wonder if someone else was out here. Maybe a local who didn't like visitors. That afternoon, I returned to the cabin, exhausted and tense. I found the front door unlocked. I was sure I'd locked it before leaving. Inside, I found signs of someone having been there. Footprints in the dust, a small fire still warm in the stove, and a few of my things moved around. Panic hit me hard, but I stayed calm. I decided to prepare for the worst. I packed my bag with essentials and set a trap. A large rock tied to a string near the door, so I could tell if anyone came back while I was inside. The night that followed was the worst. The noises came earlier, louder, and with a clear rhythm. Scratching, banging, pacing back and forth. I stayed awake the whole night, holding the pan tightly, eyes wide open, listening. At one point, the rock outside the door shifted. My heart stopped. I held my breath, watching the door, but nothing else happened. Morning came, pale and gray. I took the opportunity to leave immediately. I walked down the dirt road without stopping, not looking back once. Eventually, I reached the highway and flagged down a passing car. The driver was an older man who took me into town and called the police. They sent a couple of officers out to check the cabin that day. They found no one inside, no footprints other than mine, and no clear evidence of trespassing. Just signs of an old campfire outside that looked recent, and some food scraps animals probably dragged away. I stayed in town for a few days trying to process what had happened. The police said it might have been a local who liked to scare off visitors, or maybe someone homeless living rough in the woods. Nothing was proven. I never went back to the cabin. I never even tried to, but the memory stayed with me. The feeling of being watched, the noises at night, the unlocked door in the morning. It wasn't something I could explain, but it was real enough to keep me from ever wanting to be alone in the woods again.